Here's a thought. Imagine two critics in a room. You give them the topic, name the best of something. Then you give them the field of art, novelist, painter, singer, writer. For each of these situations in your mental picture, are the critics having a debate over who is the best in that field, or do they quickly agree? So for singer, in your mind, are they debating if it's Frank Sinatra, Maria Callas, or Aretha Franklin, or do they quickly agree on an answer? In your mind, for the best artist, are they quickly agreeing on any particular artist like Van Gogh? Or are they arguing that it could be Michelangelo or Picasso or any number of artists? I think for most fields, in your mental picture, you imagine these critics are having a debate. However, when it comes to comic books, for most people, it will be a blank mental picture. They will have no concept of what the critics will say. But for a few who do know comic books, there will be those who will imagine the critics quickly agree on who the best writer is. And I don't think you can say that about many fields. However, the comic book field is the one where there is an agreement among some, if not all, over who is the best writer. And that name is Alan Moore. Recently, Alan Moore announced his retirement from comic books. So I wanted to spend this time to give a brief biography, go over some of his most important works and what he meant to me. Please join me after the intro and I will give you my thoughts on the comic book writer Alan Moore. Welcome back. Now to go over a brief biography of Alan Moore's life and career. He was born on November 18th, 1953, in a section of Northampton called I want to say the Burrows, but I'm not exactly sure. I have Wikipedia open right here. I'm trying to do this biography as extemporaneously as possible because it'd be boring just for me to read to you. However, I do want to get the facts correct. The Burrows. He was born in an area of Northampton called the Burrows to a poor working class family. He did well enough in his education to advance to grammar school, and this is a part of his life that is very different from mine. I went to school in California in the 70s and 80s, so this idea that students are kind of winnowed between elementary and junior high did not exist in my experience of going to school in California. And this idea of going to grammar school also does not exist. We don't have grammar schools, so to speak, in America, at least not as part of our common advancement through the education system. So I mentioned all this because what happened subsequently also would be does not match my background. He was one of the highest achieving students at the level of elementary school, what they would call primary school, but then upon advancing to grammar school, found himself at the opposite end. Instead of being near the top, he was near the bottom. And he began to get in trouble and felt that he was wasting his time, and eventually he was kicked out. So from there, he moved on to being idle and then various jobs like working in a tannery for a time. And from there, just kind of slowly got into writing for zines, and then comic book career took off, or slowly, one step at a time from there. And his first work was with some British publishers. So he worked for 2000 AD and Warrior Comics before being discovered found by the American publisher DC Comics. The editor Shelley Bond was sent to England to enlist Alan Moore, and eventually a whole wave of British writers who became part of the British New Wave in American comics, which changed American mainstream comics, and I think you could argue independent comics, because Image Comics in many ways takes its output from what the British writers and artists were doing in American comics at DC in the 1990s. All that can be traced back to Alan Moore. From there, he made his mark. He began work on Swamp Thing, and after writing an issue of Swamp Thing that was so controversial that they did not want to publish it with the Comics Code Authority stamp, which was a form of ratings for comic books, but actually worse than that, it was a form of censorship. Without the Comics Code, you could not be put onto the newsstand, and before the 1980s, that was the sign of death, because the comic book stores did not become outlets for the comic book companies to distribute directly until the 1980s. At the point of the 1970s, they were simply collectors of old comics and would sell those to collectors along with the newsstand issues. But any comic book without the Comic Code Authority was dead until Alan Moore took that mainstream book Swamp Thing and turned it into a direct publisher for the market, that is, go directly to comic book stores series. And the recognition for Swamp Thing followed. He won the first of many awards in the American publishing industry. He had won some in the British industry before coming to America, beginning with Swamp Thing, and the dominoes fell after that. After Swamp Thing, the American publishers decided to finish a series he had begun called V for Vendetta, which is one work from which he is known by because it was turned into a film. Then he began work on Watchmen, which is another work which he's known by, and not only was it turned into a movie, Watchmen has also achieved acclaim outside the comic book industry. It was named by Time as one of the greatest novels of the 20th century, and it also has won the Hugo Award for Best Other Forms category. And from there, after a dispute with DC Comics over the ownership of Watchmen, one that he maintains to this day it should be his property, that he was cheated by DC Comics. It's convoluted. It's a story. From there, he went on. He left mainstream comics and began work in independent comics, doing such things as A Small Killing, which was a true life tale about a political killing of a murder of a political dissident, and began work self-published first, and then later picked up by a publisher with the tale of Jack the Ripper called From Hell. That was also turned into a film. As you can see, Hollywood was among the many people who recognized the talent of Alan Moore and began exploiting it, mining it for many terrible films. Then he returned to work with a mainstream publisher in the late 1990s and the early aughts. He claimed as a way of trying to help put the comic book publishing industry back on their feet after the second comic book implosion. The first one was in the 1970s, but this was the comic book implosion of the 1990s. It's kind of self-inflicted by the speculation market and bubble collapsing. That's a whole story into itself. But Alan Moore returned to an offshoot of Image Comics, the Wildstorm Comics, the one that was run and owned by Jim Lee. So he published many good works in this period. Only one, if I'm not mistaken, only one of which he owned, which was The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, also turned into a movie. The others, however, those fell to DC, which later bought out Wildstorm. And so many of the works he created in this period he doesn't own the copyright to. Promethea, Tom Strong, Top 10. And so again, many other people are getting rich off the genius of Alan Moore's own writing. And so from there, he kind of just swore off mainstream comics. Around this time, he published his first novel, which was Voice of the Fire, a sort of copy, I want to say copy, it was an homage to Joyce's work about Dublin in that it's the same style, but in this case it's for his hometown in Northampton. So just like Joyce, he's interested in the history of language and how it interconnects with the history of a place and a people. It's a quite interesting read. And then so he returned work to League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, the one thing that he still owned, and began doing some work in the vein of Lovecraft that was his own owned work, and finished with the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. So that finished just last month. And his most recent novel was Jerusalem, a 1,000+ page tome. And as far as I'm aware of, he intends to continue writing novels from this point forward. So now, let me go over my own appreciation of Alan Moore, my thoughts about his writing. My first recognition or knowledge of Alan Moore came from a trip to the Comic-Con in the mid-1980s up to the late 1990s. I went to Comic-Con every year. And at first, the tickets were given to me by my grandmother as a gift. Later, I was a volunteer. Then later, even more than that, when I moved to San Francisco, I would make a special trip to San Diego to go. So for about 15 years, I think, 15 years, I went every year continuously. And it was a much different con then than it is now. But in any event, the year 1985 was the year Alan Moore went to the convention, the only year he's gone to San Diego Comic-Con. At that point, I was not aware of Alan Moore, and I made friends with a boy who was in the line, a boy my age. We began talking about our favorite comics and what were we excited to see at the con, and I told him I was excited to see the Teen Titans panel. At that point, the 2 comic books I read every month. I didn't have money as a kid. I would buy Teen Titans and X-Men month in, month out. Whatever money I had, I would save to make sure I could get those 2. So I was excited to see Marv Wolfman and George Perez at the panel. And then he told me he wanted to see this British writer, Alan Moore, who was doing great work on Swamp Thing. I had no idea who it is, who he was at that point. And the line was so long that when we got in, it was about 5 minutes before Alan Moore's panel was going to begin. And as we were going in, there was a sale right at the front of the convention. And I convinced this newfound friend to get into the stacks and grab some stuff before we went to see Alan Moore. And I still feel bad about it to this day. We got to the panel late. Just as we got into the room, I saw this British man with the overflowing black hair and long beard saying, "Well, that's it, guys. Thanks so much for coming to see me, and I hope that you will read more of my work." And then everyone clapped, and that was it. He walked off the stage. I saw Alan Moore for 2 or 3 minutes, and my friend was crestfallen. And I told him, "Well, don't worry about it. Everyone comes to Comic-Con every year. You'll catch him next year." I had no idea that was going to be the only time Alan Moore is at Comic-Con. So those are one of the small guilts I've carried with me ever since. I can say I've seen Alan Moore for the briefest of times, briefest moments, but the long shot of it is, the upshot, I was aware of who Alan Moore was. And so at that convention, someone had Miracle Man on sale. I found them in the bins, scattered issues. They're like odd issue here, odd issue there. I bought them, and I was just blown away. I did not understand how hard it was going to be to find the remaining issues of that. I think it was maybe, that's his 85. I don't think I completed that series till 1988. I think it took me to find all the issues. And it took a long time for that series to finish too, because the artist who was working on it, I want to say John Totalben, he ended up coming down with an eye disorder. And so it took him the longest time to finish drawing. So Miracle Man is infamous for how long it was between the beginning of it and the completion of Alan Moore's run. But it didn't matter when Alan Moore was going to finish. I did not find all those issues for another 4 years. It took me a long time. And it was at Comic-Con 4 years later where I finally completed the story. But I was just blown away by the writing, the depth, the realism, and the imagination, the way that he was able to combine realism and imagination. And that was the hallmark of Alan Moore's writing at that point. He would change. The industry would ape what he did. But at that point in his career, his concept was people don't regard superhero comic books as serious. So let's take them as realistically as possible. Let's take this idea, if superheroes were real and we don't talk down to the people reading it, what would happen? A, B, Z. Let's just follow this train of thought. And that is what Watchmen is. And I think, I don't want to say V for Vendetta because that is a political work. It's a different kind of, it's a political thriller. It's a different kind of work. But you can definitely see it in Watchmen. You can see it in what I was just talking about, Miracle Man. And I think those two are the principal places where you can see that realism that he was striving for. And so I was in. And now I think that's an introduction to why I began to appreciate Alan Moore. Let's look at his work, his career. I'm going to take just the list of notable comics that is on Wikipedia here, because why not? Rather than just picking some source, I will just stick with Wikipedia. It's a good list. So, V for Vendetta, political thriller. The artwork, it was originally done in black and white, and then when it was published through Vertigo Comics, they decided to colorize it, but they used these muted hues. So it would remain principally black and white, and they would use 2 or 3 colors for each page. So it's a very unique artistic expression. And also, so you may know Alan Moore from the Guy Fawkes mask that was first used in close to popular culture in V for Vendetta, and then was later taken up by Anonymous. When people post on the internet as Anonymous, they use that Guy Fawkes mask. Marvel Man, this is a story. The name Marvel Man, Miracle Man, it's a deal. But this is a copy of Shazam, the British copy, and Alan Moore took this copy and then made it much more of a realistic examination of utopia/dystopia. Skiz, I don't know. That's a British title. Ballad of Halo Jones, I've heard, is well regarded. I've heard many good things about it. I haven't read it. Swamp Thing, I've read the majority of the run. I like it. It's not in my top 5 of Alan Moore, and that's an exception. Many people consider it his best. Watchmen, greatest graphic novel of all time, and it's one of my 5 favorite books of all time. Batman the Killing Joke, very controversial. I loved it for many years, and then with the animated film that came out last year, I finally understood why Alan Moore disavowed it, because he takes the concept of Batman and maybe misunderstands it, but the way he writes Batman is that Batman understands he will kill Joker. It's right there at the beginning. He's writing a Batman who will one day kill. And the core principle of Batman is that he does not kill. At least that's the idealized Batman. Unfortunately, many iterations of Batman he does kill. So Alan Moore falls along the lines of people who've written a Batman who, in this case, could potentially kill. But Alan Moore, I think, feels that was a mistake. From Hell, an exploration of the 20th century through the lens of Jack the Ripper. I think it's the best way of putting it. It's about the Jack the Ripper case, but in the Jack the Ripper case, Alan Moore saw the seeds of what would become the 20th century. So that's what makes it different from a serial killer book. A Small Killing, the real life political killing of a dissident. Lost Girls, I have not read. It's his pornography work. Top 10 is a crime procedural and a superhero comic book put together. So think of Legion of Superheroes and Hill Street Blues combined. Promethea was Alan Moore's take on Wonder Woman, but heavily using the ideas and themes of magic. As he says, he is a magician, so he wanted to take that fantasy and then use magic as practiced by or believed by people in our world, the real world, not the comic book world, and use that as the grounding for what would be a female avatar of strength and magic, such as Wonder Woman is for DC Comics. Tom Strong is kind of Alan Moore's combination of the pulp heroes and Superman. League of Extraordinary Gentlemen is his take on using older characters who are in the public domain and creating a superhero team with them. And then this was the first two graphic novels were in the early 20th century, and then he later extended that all the way up to present day. So you can follow those adventures of different iterations of the League from as far as I'm aware, the early 19th into the early 20th. The Courtyard, I have not read. I think that's one of his Lovecraft works. Neonomicon is a Lovecraft work, one of his Lovecraft works. Fashion Beast was a screenplay that he wrote for Malcolm McLaren, the late producer who was famous for the Sex Pistols. And then Providence, I believe, is another Lovecraft work. So he finished his comic book career with all those Lovecraft works. Then we have the two novels. Voice of the Fire, I have read, as I said, is the Joyce-influenced novel about Northampton. And then Jerusalem is his 1,000-page opus set in modern-day Northampton, but I think it's also Joycean, and that there is a bit of the history about Northampton. So that is the career of Alan Moore in a nutshell, more or less. If you are familiar with his work, please leave a comment. Let me know what is your favorite and why. If you have not read his work and you're watching this and I've inspired you to read something and you need advice, leave a comment about what sort of writing you like, and then I'll try to do my best to recommend which of Alan Moore's pieces you should begin with. My main light just died out, so that's about time for me to finish. Okay, thank you for joining me. That's all for now. Take care and be well. Goodbye.